This lesson is about multifetal gestations. That means more than one fetus in one uterus at the same time. This could mean any number of gestations, but to keep it simple, I'm going to talk about twinning. And this subject often confuses learners. It probably won't if you watched our basic sciences stuff, but if you haven't, I'm going to try to bring the information from there to here that makes it so easy. And it's also difficult because there are big, scary words that people don't really tell you what they are. And so we're going to be talking mainly about monozygotic twinning, one zygote twins, identical twins, and the timing of the twinning event. Dizygotic twins, two separate oocytes, two separate fertilizations, two separate implantations, one uterus, is taken care of by one of the categories of monozygotic. So dizygotic's not going to get a whole lot of airtime in this lesson. It increases when you induce ovulation. No kidding. If you induce ovulation and more than one oocyte is released, more than one oocyte can be fertilized and then implant. So we're going to take it back to embryo. Don't worry. And we're going to use that information to easily explain monozygotic twinning and the nomenclature. On the day of fertilization, the zona pellucida is still intact. The one cell replicates. In here are blastomeres. Blastomeres are totipotent. They're going to be represented by the black swirly. Black swirly, undifferentiated, can become an entire organism. Differentiation happens from the outside in over time. When you have an ultrasound and you're diagnosing twins, you're going to look for the number of placentas, number of amnions, and number of fetuses. This is one zygote. You will report the zygosity, chorionicity, and amnionicity of a multifetal gestation. Let's see what that means. First thing, differentiate. Day 3. The chorion differentiates. And within it, swirling, totipotent cells. We're going to go normal singleton left to right, and then we're going to go twinning down the board. Day 8, the chorion had already differentiated. Differentiation from the outside in. Amnion differentiates next. Day 13. The chorion has already differentiated. The amnion has already differentiated. And now the embryo differentiates. From the outside in. Chorion 3, amnion 8, embryo 13, convenient 5 in between. Okay. If the twinning event happens prior to day 3, nothing will have differentiated. There'll be two independent organisms that are totipotent. So that on day 3, the chorions will differentiate. And because the chorions are differentiated, and differentiation happens from the outside in, it must be that there are going to be two chorions, two amnions, and a fetus in each its own amniotic and chorionic cavity. That was if the twinning event was before day 3. If the twinning event is after day 3, you are going to have a single chorion with 2 totipotent organisms. So that when day 8 hits, you're going to have 1 chorion, but 2 amnions within totipotent organisms. Day 13, the embryo differentiates. The amnions and the chorions already differentiated, so the 2 fetuses, embryos, differentiate within their own amnion. Twinning event before day 3, twinning event before 3 and 8. If the twinning event happens after day 8 but before day 13, the amnion will have already differentiated. So there'll be 1 chorion, 1 amnion, and the twinning event, 2 totipotent organisms. On day 13, you're going to get 1 chorion, 1 amnion, and 2 embryos. If that twinning event happens after day 13, after differentiation of the embryo, you will have 1 chorion, 1 amnion, and, quote, 1 fetus, as they will be conjoined. These monozygotic twinning events, the outcomes, are named by how many chorions and how many amnions there are. The number of chorions can either be mono for 1 chorion or di for 2. The same is true for the number of amnions. Mono for 1, di for 2. And it is chorions, amnion, monozygotic. So, put it to the test. If the twinning event happened before day 3, here's what you get. You have 2 red things, di, 2 green things, di, and it came from 1 zygote. So we listed as a dichorionic, red thing, placenta, diamnionic, green thing, amnion. If the twinning event is after day 3, but before day 8, you've got 1 red thing, so monochorionic, 2 green things, diamniotic. People have started taking to write mo and di. Mono means 1, di means 2. It's not that much difficult to say 2 syllables, so I stick with mono. Monochorionic, diamnionic, monozygotic. Twin. If you have the twinning event between 8 and 13, how many red things? 1. Monochorionic. How many green things? 1. Monoamniotic. 1 zygote. And after 13, it's also a mono-mono. Monozygote. But it is conjoined. Conjoined twins. There is risk associated with any multifetal gestation, and the more fetuses there are, the greater that risk. The monozygotic di-di represents the same risks as having a dizygotic pregnancy. 2 independent gestations with 2 independent placentas. So the risk listed here is going to be true of all twins, and as we move to the right, we'll add on a uniqueness for that type of twin. The main risk is because there's 2 organisms gestating. They take up the same amount of space that they would, but the uterus can't get twice as big. So you're going to see low birth weights, and the uterus is going to be sensing the increased prostaglandins and the increased size, and so there's a likelihood of preterm delivery. The due date is still 40 weeks, but the delivery date is accelerated more or less by 4 weeks per gestation. It's not exactly true, but it's rough. Because they're both in each other's way, breech presentation is common. And because of that breech, there's also an increased rate of cesarean. And because there are two placentas, there can be an increased risk of placental pathology. So the eclampsia, hypertension spectrum is seen more often in twinning than not. And then there's this thing you should know about, vanishing twin. You diagnose twins within 1 aborts, it disappears. That can happen. That's because they're just in each other's way. A monochorionic diamniotic monozygotic twin has separate umbilical cords protected by each amnion. But those umbilical cords go to one red thing. And so that means both umbilical cords are connected to a common vascular supply, which means that there's the opportunity for twin-twin transfusion. The recipient of the transfusion is going to be bigger and do more poorly. And that's because they got donated more blood. The blood was drained from one twin and given to the other. You'd think that would make them better, but it's actually just more hemoglobin and more bilirubin for the big one to process. Smaller one does better. When you have a mono-mono, the umbilical cords share a common sac and are floating around in the same fluid, which means it's possible that the cords can become entangled. So in addition to everything we've had on the board so far, mono-mono has increased risk of cord entanglement. The cords get entangled, they wrap around one another, and they essentially tie off the venous return coming back from the placenta. That results dead fetuses. And lastly, mono-mono with conjoined, the complication risk is the fact that they're conjoined and that they may need surgery to be separated, or they may spontaneously abort. So monochorionic, monoamniotic, all that means is how many chorions, how many amnions, and differentiation from the outside in day 3, chorion, 8, amnion, 13, embryo. This is useful for knowing when the splitting event was, but not necessarily how to identify a woman who might have twins. And so because there are 2 gestations, there's going to be more stuff produced, more HCG, more alpha-fetoprotein, and they're going to take up more space. So you can suspect that a woman has twins or multifetal gestation if her uterus is large for dates, more than 1 centimeter per gestational age. Or there may be an elevated HCG and someone checks because of really bad morning sickness which can be had at any time during the day, but it's called morning sickness, or because of hyperemesis gravidarum. And then the other way this comes up is an increase in the alpha-fetoprotein found on the first trimester aneuploidy screening. In any case, there's a reason to get an ultrasound. And on that ultrasound, you can look for a couple of things. The first is the sex. This can be done later on in gestation, but for this, and for what you're going to be asked about on licensing exams, follow this workflow. If the sexes are different, it means that they have non-identical DNA. Monozygotic twins have exactly the same DNA because they came from one zygote. They're identical twins, and therefore cannot have different sex. If there is a different sex, it must mean that there are 2 separate fertilization events, which means dizygotic. If they are the same, it does not mean that is monozygotic. It just means it could be. And so at this point, you merely assume mono. And the next thing you look at is the number of chorions. How many placentas are there? If there are 2, and the sex is the same, you can't tell if it's a di-di monozygotic or a dizygotic. So you can't tell the mother whether or not she's going to have identical twins, but you know that there are twins, and those carry risk. Breech, cesarean, preterm, etc. If there's only one, then you know for certain that this must be a monozygotic twin. And there's only one thing left to look for, the number of amnions. If there are 2, and you have 1 chorion, you have a monochorionic diamnionic monozygotic twin. They add on the risk of twin-twin transfusion. If there is only 1 amnion, you have a mono-mono monozygotic. This is how you're going to see it. This is how I write it. The extra risk associated with monozygotic is going to be cord entanglement and opportunity for being conjoined. If you happen to look really early on, before week 10, it's really easy to see the amnion and the amniotic fluid floating in the chorionic cavity. Usually, women don't get diagnosed with twins until later, and so you still have to find a way, how many chorions, how many amnions. The trouble is, there's a limited space in the uterus and they smush up against each other. So the ultrasound findings you're looking for is twin peak sign. When 2 placentas come close together with a thick membrane separating the black fluid, because there's an amnion you probably can't see and a fetus gestating in the amniotic fluid. Now, twin peak sign has nothing to do with the movie, the TV show, or the restaurant chain. It's a twin peak because there's twins, and it's a peak because I don't know why, but that's what it's called. Then there's T sign. What T sign is going to be a 1 chorion. And then there's going to be 2 amnions. And so the amnions get smushed. They're a thin white line that surrounds a fetus and its amniotic fluid. Thick, twin peak sign, 2 chorions. If 2 chorions, must be 2 amnions. T sign, 1 chorion, 2 amnions. So multifetal gestation really isn't that hard, right? You just have to know that chorion is placenta and amnion is the thing that holds the amniotic fluid. And know the dates. Day 3, day 8, day 13. Differentiates from the outside in, red thing, green thing, blue thing. When it gains a color, it stays that thing. There's only 1 of them. If it's twins split before the differentiation, there'll be 2 of them. If the twinning event happens after differentiation, 1 of them. And you simply put the number 1 mono or 2 di in order of chorionicity, amnionicity, and always finish it off with monozygotic. That is multifetal gestation.